So we move on, and we'll see if we can get through the whole rest of the games in this particular conversation. So we start with a tied series 1-1 in Winnipeg in Game 3, which, first of all, was a very strange place to have a game. They force the four games in Moscow will all take place in the four games in Russia will all take place in Moscow. So they played all the games in one location. Canada, of course, played four games in four different locations, of which certainly Winnipeg and Vancouver would be, for different reasons, the obviously the least intense places for Canada to play. Maple Leaf Gardens is easily would be the most focused Canadian arena. It's where Canada had their training camp. It would have made sense to have played maybe Game 1 in Montreal and played the other three in Toronto. Again, when you understand that Hockey Canada and people think it doesn't really matter where they play, they're going to win all the games, so it's make a nice celebration across the country. But Game 3 goes to Winnipeg, and because that's where Hockey Canada had its offices at the time. What's interesting about this game is that it's like forgotten in the series. It's like, if you want to talk about it with anybody, almost nobody even remembers that it happened. They can talk about all the other games, but no one talks about this game. It's literally like just a game that's been, and maybe because it was tied, that it just, and somewhat, there's not a lot to remember from the game, so it's literally not remembered. What the tie game does in the course of this goofy choice of an 8-game series is it makes it a 7-game series because there were no other ties in the game. So the series does become a 4-3 winner like a normal 7-game series would be. So this throwaway game kind of exemplifies that, turning it into a 7-game series. But it's, like I say, it's mostly forgotten. And the two quick takeaways to make from this particular game was, one, this was claimed that this was a game that showed Canada's poor conditioning because Canada had wound up with a 4-2 lead in the game and wound up 2 quick goals from the Soviets, made it 4-4. But that's not really true if you watch the third period. They were pretty much, it was a pretty even third period. The Soviets maybe outplayed Canada a bit in the third period, and maybe they did have a slight conditioning edge, but not as great as it's tried to present. This was a very even hockey game based on the fact that the Soviets were prepared, well versed with each other, had played most of their life with the players they were playing with. The Canadians were playing with brand new players, and you've had this element that it really took a long time. It probably didn't happen until Sweden. They were still very divided at this time. So a member of the Boston Bruins would not talk to a member of the Rangers or the Canadians. You didn't talk with players who were not from your team. So there were still internal divisions where the Bruins talked together and did things together. The Rangers talked together and did things together. The couple of guys that maybe then you'd have the outside guys from Quebec. Well, they might go and talk together. The guys from out west, well, they might go and talk together. So you had these incredible divisions between the players that took a long time to come together, and that the majority of the lines, the guys had never played together before. Right, the way the lines were structured at the beginning of this was Mahovlich, Cournoyer, and Esposito. Well, Esposito had never played with the two of them. Mahovlich and Cournoyer were playing together with the Canadians, but Esposito had never played with them. And it takes a while, I think, to play with Phil Esposito to learn how you're supposed to play with the guy. Henderson, Clark, and Ellis seemed to get together really well. I think part of the reason for that was, one, none of them really expected to be playing. They thought they were guys who were going to just be there, but it was only because they played so well, they were so prepared, and they played so well as a line in the training camp that they were playing. But for Henderson and Ellis, who played together in Toronto, Bobby Clarke was very close in some instances to the way Dave Keon played. If you just took away the nasty element of Clarke, he's very much like Dave Keon. So for the two of them, for Ellis and Henderson, I don't think it would have been that much of a change to get used to Bobby Clarke over Dave Keon. Let's look at like some of the other lines that would have been put together. Dennis Hull, Jean Ratelle, Rod Gilbert. So you've got Ratelle and Gilbert who would have played together. They didn't play. That's not a line in this game. I know Gilbert didn't play in this game. I'm just making a point. So in a case like this, okay, Ratelle and Gilbert know each other, and it takes a while for Dennis Hull to get used to how to play on this line. So these are, like for example, in this game, I think the line was Parise, Esposito, and Cashman. So Esposito and Cashman play together with the Bruins on the same line. Parise had been a Bruin before the 68 expansion draft when he went to Minnesota. So in the pre-draft era, when all the players on a team were signed in through what was known as the C form, where you were basically turned into a slave of the organization for a very small amount of money when you were 14 or 15 years old. But what it did do is from that time, you were being taught that team's system of play. So technically, Cashman and Esposito didn't have to have ever played. Okay, yeah, I know Esposito came up in the Chicago farm system before anybody. It's just an example. We'll use Cashman and Parise for example. Even if Cashman and Parise never really played together, and they might have, because they're around the same age, and they might have played together in the Bruins minor league system. But even if they hadn't, the point being is that they would have been taught the same way. The entire structure of the Boston Bruins' entire farm system. So from the time these guys are playing junior at 16, they're learning a particular structure of play that the New York Rangers teams would be learning different. The Leaf teams would be learning something different. Every team would be learning something a bit different based on that structure. And that, you can say, the draft in all levels, including minor hockey and every hockey, has opened up this ability for weak teams to get better, and it's added more parity. But what it's also done is it's made the players, by the time they get to the NHL, they're not being trained in a system anymore. Like if the San Jose Sharks draft a player, well, he hasn't had 4 years previously of the San Jose Sharks thinking and training and ideas and preparation, and only that team has basically been watching that player carefully to figure out how they might fit into their system and how they're going to use them. So bizarrely, from the C form aspect, if a player's been in the farm in that system of that team since they were like 15 years old, their mentality is understood. And you do see that Sinden tried, certainly at the beginning, to put as many of these players together who had familiarity. Even if they're not on the same team exactly now, they may have come out of the same system. They may have come out of the same C-form system, so they'd have the same kind of thinking, the same kind of way of playing. Because again, the Soviets these guys have played together for 15 years, right? The system of, we'll call it like a system of excellence, which you found in even like through the last, I think it's relatively recent, like in Czechoslovakia and Prague, really good players at the age of 13 and 14 are, I can't say are now because I don't know how the system of hockey works right now in the Czech Republic, but certainly in the over the last 10 to 15 years and prior, a player like that would be caught out at a very young age and would be put into a sports school. So they would be in a particular high school with like the 20 best athletes, 20 best hockey players, like, their age and around their age in that city. And they would be training together, living together, eating together, and they would be up against the best possible player all the time. These kind of things don't happen in North America. You don't take, even when you look at, say, like the junior hockey, where it's literally just a draft and there's 40 teams and they're going to go wherever. The players have very little say in what's going on. And it was one of the worst things. It was a It was a really crappy moment in my life, actually, when I did actually get drafted. I'd been hoping partially that I didn't get drafted into the OHL so that I might then be able, if I wanted to go that route and didn't want to go for a university scholarship in the US, that I would have had more opportunity as a free agent, because then I could have talked to every possible team and see who might have actually been interested as compared to who wasn't. A draft locks you in. It's a very, for a capitalist society that North America is, to run a draft indicates how what's the word I'm looking for? How absolutely controlled sports is, and how what's the word? It's against antitrust laws technically, and they can only get around that by making sure they proclaim themselves as an entertainment industry and not as anything else. Because in entertainment, you, in a sense, don't have to be fair. You don't have to care what anybody thinks. Anyway, I'm not going to get into a long discussion about drafts and the terrible nature of drafts, and actually how it's hurt the long-term sport, and how it's actually over time slowed the development of players in North America. But that's one thing that another element that the Soviets had was familiarity. And so the longer the series goes, if you watch carefully, particularly by the time they play the games in Soviet Union, you start to notice that the Canadian familiarity is much different than it was in the first few games, where it was still a very individualized kind of do the best you can, and the other players kind of have to figure it out. They started to know what they were going to do. Second thing I should bring up at this point, for those of you who are thinking of watching the series, not just some highlights, who are actually going to watch games, full complete games. The games are rather, what's the word I'm looking for? Dull is not the word, but they are, let's just say, it's called the greatest hockey series ever, so people expect to see the greatest hockey from the standpoint of skills and entertainment value and whatnot. That's not what you're going to see here in this series. Already by the 76 Canada Cup, for example, the game that Canada played against the Soviet Union, game 2 and Canada played against Czechoslovakia, they were far better games. Certainly by the 80s, the Canada Cup games in the 80s, the level of play had just, so from the standpoint of level of play, it's compared to certainly everything that comes after it, from watching the Red Army play Montreal in the New Year's Eve game in 75, or games that happened in the 90s. This game will just not compare from the standpoint of quality of play. You have to watch the game. If you're going to appreciate the games, you have to appreciate the games for the intensity of the play from both sides, from the importance that was on both of these teams psychologically and mentally going into these games, and the recognition that definitely from the Canadian side, that losing was not acceptable. That literally they would have, and again, we'll talk at the end of this how really losing would have been the best thing that could have happened for Canadian hockey long term. But short term, losing would have been a disaster for the entire country, and a potential and a literal disaster for these players. It would have been a hellish experience had they actually lost this series. So you had that kind of pressure. You had the pressure of each side, one way or another, psychologically needing to prove that their system was better than the other. The Soviet players were very versed in that this is an opportunity for you to prove that communism is better than capitalism, and this was the opportunity for Canadian players to prove that capitalism is better than communism. And as the series goes on, as it gets more intense, as it gets closer to the end, it does become more warlike. You'll see elements of it in the games in Canada, but nothing like you'll see when the games start in Sweden and then move on to Moscow. And not that I'm trying to say it is war for anybody who's actually be in a war with a rifle and firing shots at another person across a field. Not like game 6 or game 7 or whatever. The series is the same, but this will be about as close as a hockey series will get, along with maybe the the Montreal Quebec series of the 1980s. There's not really many others that where the level of or when I can just think of a few others, like when Oshawa played Ottawa or Peterborough in the early 80s, and I guess there was a couple of series when like New Westminster played Victoria, that you maybe had these levels where it was actual war on the ice. That's so you have to, if you can appreciate the games, that's what you're seeing. You're in some way watching an ideological war taking place through a hockey series. Then you can understand the games that you're watching. You can actually understand what you see on the screen. If you try to look at it from the standpoint of exemplary, fantastic hockey, then no, you're not going to see that here. You'll see tiny flashes of this from both sides, of course, but that's not what this series is. And had a series like this maybe taken place in like January or February, like had they shut down the NHL for 2 weeks in February and played this series then, when the Canadian team is in their peak shape, they're ready to go, they've been prepared for this, you might have seen a different quality to the series. So certainly that this was played in September, and that at this point in time, no Canadian players had ever been ready to play hockey games in September. That was just beyond the preparation and the thinking. You were not going to be able to see the best possible series. And it's every time you get a team that raises its level, if the other team realizes they've got to raise their own if you're going to compete with them. So I don't doubt that if this game series had been played in February, the Canadian team would have been better. Like they would have been where they were in Moscow, but better than that. The Soviets to compete would have had to play better themselves. But it is what it is. So that's game 3 in Winnipeg. The pretty much forgotten game is the best way to describe it. Game 4 in Vancouver, without going, because again, I'm not analyzing the games, I'm analyzing things around the games. Easily the worst game for Canada of the series. I can't really say it was a great game for the Soviets necessarily. It was just a very, very bad game for Canada, and a very mentally poor game. Not so much a physically poor game. It was mental breakdowns that cost this team the game. There was a mental breakdown from the coaching staff, first of all, by putting in a lot of players who hadn't played yet. Again, this promise that had been made to all of these guys, you come to play for Canada, it's going to be a fun series, everybody gets to play, you play here. So Sinden still, I guess from the tie, felt that they had a lot of room to move, and that and some of the additions, were good additions, like Gilbert Perreault. Even though he's young, he should have been playing. Guys that could skate should have been in the lineup. Gilbert Perreault should have been in the lineup early on. But a lot of other choices were poor choices. They took Cashman out of the series because they felt he'd be in the penalty box the whole time, not because they're disappointed with how he played, disappointed how he was being officiated. And of course, he didn't, as we'll talk about, he didn't get to play any of the games in Russia. But if he did, I guarantee Cashman would have been in the penalty box the whole game in the Soviet Union. The replacement that came in was Bill Goldsworthy, and Goldsworthy, if Canada lost the series, he would have been at the top of the list for reasons for why they lost. He takes 2 really dumb, either they're elbowing or high sticking. I don't even remember what penalties are in the first 6 or 7 minutes of the first period. And the Soviets scored 2 power play goals. And that pretty much ended the game right there. But you could see a lot of other stupidity, like Frank Mahovlich sitting on Vladislav Tretiak for 30 seconds. Or there was just, you watch it and there's just a lot of really dumb mental choices made by Team Canada in the course of the game that even though there was close and there was a goal called back and a few other things, they're just, when you look at it when you look at the game as a whole, there was not enough things done right to say that even with a few things done differently, Canada could have won this game. This was a guaranteed loss based on the lineup choices, based on the mental attitude going into the game and the way the mental attitude was played forth. The game is remembered, of course, for the ending, we'll call it, interview that happened between Johnny Esau and Phil Esposito, in which the player that had been the chosen as the best player in the game gets to do this interview. And Canadian fans had been booing quite a bit in the course of the game. Now, by this point, you've got a group of fans in Canada who are not liking what they see Canada playing, A, from the standpoint of they're not winning, B, from the standpoint of they don't like the fact that Canada's playing a style that the Soviets are not playing. They're playing a different style. And so you had this group of people that were upset from that level. Vancouver, though, is a very different place in Canada. Certainly in the early 70s. Canada was a very fractured country in the 60s and 70s. Certainly Quebec was always threatening to try to get out. You had just had the FLQ crisis in 1970 in Montreal 2 years before, where you had you had the Canadian Army put on the streets in Montreal after the kidnappings of a couple of British diplomats. So you had from the Quebec side, you had this constant source of separation, but you had British Columbia in itself, which was we'll not call it communist, but a socialist thinking mindset as you would get in Canada was all in British Columbia. So as this series was moving on and the Soviets are playing better and better, there was a large contingent of people in British Columbia specifically who was very happy about this. They were very happy that the communist society of Russia of the Soviet Union was winning in the series. And a lot of them were in the crowd at that game in Vancouver. And the displeasure was a combination of Canadian fans just really wanting Canada to win this series, and there were others who were there because they had wanted Canada to lose this series right from the beginning. When it ended, and again, you should watch some of the documentaries, but Esposito goes out, he does this interview, a very heartfelt interview, and to the best that he could do, given what you could say and not say on television in the 1970s, he wrote a very fine line of what to say, what not to say. The interviewer, Johnny Esau, it was a terrible interview. The questions he was asking was terrible. I mean, he was at least smart enough to keep asking something, to keep Esposito talking, but everything Esposito was saying, he was unbelievably apologetic, and like he just wasn't grasping what was going on. You know, your typical sort of kind of talking head reporter at the time. And it's highly better to watch the interview without his questions, to just watch Esposito's conversation. It has much more impact than having to watch and hear the actual back and forth interview. But when it ended, Esposito talked about, as he was skating off the ice, there were people in the crowd screaming, "Don't you see communism is better now? Communism is supreme. Canada is a shambles." And he said as he left the ice, he finally realized that they were actually in a war, that this was not actually some sort of hockey series, that this was a societal versus societal war. And he had said something like, "And we had to get ourselves together." So it was a very interesting dynamic that the end of that game made a psychological change in the players when they realized not just that up to that time, the best they could do was not enough to beat them on their home, in their home country, but that the majority of the population now hated them. When they left for Europe a few days later from Toronto, I think there were like 40 people that were at the airport to wish them off. So they already felt as they were leaving the country that they were very much isolated. It would get worse when they go to Sweden. They played 2 exhibition games in Stockholm, which was set up as a way for the team to prepare, as the team to get used to the bigger ice surface, which was important. This was important. That trip to Sweden was really important. Also important, the wives were not there. The wives were not going to show up until they got to Moscow. So a number of things happened in Stockholm. So the team is by themselves. They're away from Canada. They're already starting to feel Canada does not like them. They're going to find out even worse. They're playing these. They're now there, and they're alone. Right? They've got no family, no friends, no spouses, nothing. It's just them. So combination of they start to bond together as a group of guys who are under the gun. They're able to bond together with no one to answer questions to. They could go out till 3:00 in the morning, and there's no one waiting at their door to ask them, "What are you doing? Where have you been?" So they could go out and do what they wanted for a while, which I know they haven't really talked about it, but that would have been important too for them to have this bonding time together. But then they had practice time. So they practiced every day. Very, very important practices with no important games to be played, just these games with the Swedes, but very, very important practices, getting used to the big ice surface. Then they play the games with Sweden, and now they start to get used to the kind of refereeing that they're going to get, because at least 2 of the referees who are calling the games in Sweden will be calling the games in Russia. And the games were pretty much a disaster in Sweden. The games were extremely nasty. The Swedish and the Canadian national teams had a long hatred and history in the games they played in the 1960s, and a lot of the Swedish players felt this was their chance to get back at a whole lot of stuff that happened in the 60s against NHL players. And without, again, going into the incredible details, along with certainly what Canadians at the time would feel was terrible refereeing and terrible abilities of the 2-referee system, which was not used in North America, right? It was a 1-referee, 2-linesman system. There was a huge brawl at the end of the first period of game 1 that spilled over into the hallway. The Swedish police had to come with police dogs. You had Wayne Cashman get his tongue sliced off so intently by a spear by, I think it was Ulf Sterner who speared him, requiring, I can't remember if it was 40 or 50 stitches or something to handle that. When the Canadians often responded, there was a stick swinging battle between, I think it was Sealing and I can't remember who he was with. There was one where Vic Hadfield smashed his stick into the nose of Lars-Erik Schuberg, I think it was, broke his nose. And the end result of the games, which I think they were tied or 1-goal games, but was the pictures, of course, on the front page of the Swedish newspapers were claiming that the Canadians were hooligans and that they had attacked the poor Swedish players. You know, the spearing of people like Cashman and everybody else, and the butt ends and the spitting and everything else that the Swedish players did to the Canadians. That was, of course, not presented in the newspapers. No surprise. But this was the presentation. The Canadians were hooligans, gangsters, and their own ambassador. So they were going to have a reception at the Canadian embassy, and the Canadian ambassador in Sweden had very unkind words for the team. And so you're in a foreign country where you are competing at what you now understand is a war against technically your ideological enemy. And your own government is now you know your own government is against you. So at this point in time, now you've got a team where the other team hates you, your country hates you, All of your politicians and anyone who's supposed to be representing you hates you. The referees hate you. The fans hate you. What you've done is you've created a very cornered group of hockey players who feel that the whole world is against them. And so they use this experience to bond extremely tight, like extremely tight. And in war mentality, right? They finished basic training as a unit, and they're ready to die for each other at this point in time. That's the kind of mentality that they've got. It's a very dangerous place to play another team, particularly in a sport like hockey, when they are up against the wall and they got nothing to lose. That's a very dangerous team to play, because they're totally unpredictable at that point, and they could do anything. Two interesting things come out of that series as well. We're going to talk about the Soviets and some of the mistakes they were making, but Canada, through that, produced a better team, a more tight team. There's going to be some cracks in the entire team system. We also have to get the cracks, but one of the key elements that have finished the process of bringing that team together was just before they were about to leave to Moscow. A message came in from the Soviet embassy saying that there's a problem with the hotel and there aren't enough rooms, and so your wives can no longer come to Russia. And the players got together to kind of say, we're done with this shit. And the message was quite simple. If the wives don't go to Russia, we don't go to Russia. And the whole team was 100% backing this meeting and conversation. That's the deal. If they don't go, we don't go. We're going home. And of course, the Soviets are fairly convinced that they're going to win the series. They're up 2-1. They got 4 games at home. The mindset is they're going to win the series. So while they're already beginning the mental tactics that will become much bigger when they get to Moscow, but they did cave in. They magically found the rooms available. Oh, all of a sudden, the rooms are there. Off you come. But it was the last great bonding moment for Team Canada. On the flip side, like I said, the Soviets were very clear they were going to now win this. And when they returned to Moscow, there was a tournament that was going on. It was like one of the regular scheduled tournaments that normally happens. But so some of the players in the national team were on teams in this tournament, others weren't. And the head coach of that team, which, as I mentioned, Tarasov and Chernesiev, were no longer coaching the Soviet national team. This was now Bobrov and Kulagin. And they gave the players who are not in that tournament a week off, which that doesn't happen. Like, you don't, if you're a hockey player in the Soviet Union in the 1960s and 70s, there's no such thing as a week off. Like, there's almost no such thing as a day off, never mind a week. So Alexander Maltsev had talked about later how he'd never even heard of something like this, and he had to phone up a bunch of his friends, and they went to Sochi for a week and sat on the beach, and and then came back. They all reassembled a couple of days before the tournament started to get ready to play again. And this was obviously a major error. The Soviet interconnected first fitness and their interconnected team play was broken. So they were doing other things. They were thinking about other things. They were with other players while Canada was at the same time in Sweden going through basically hell together. And so you had this beginning of Canada is squeezing and tightening themselves together. The Soviets are in some way have dismantled and have to start pulling themselves together when they restart in Moscow, and it doesn't really go well for them. And that's a big part of the reason. They were warned, though. the Soviet scout at the time, I think it was Boris Mayarov, one of their famous players. He was the key scout for them, and he was in He was in watching the games in Sweden. His report back to coaching staff in Moscow was something like, um, you are now going to be playing against a very angry hockey team. So he warned them. He warned them what was coming, and the coaching staff, for whatever reason, did not take that seriously. When when the team arrived in Moscow, it was a very difficult thing for the players. It was a very difficult thing for the Soviet system. This is like one of the, again, it's not the first outside team to come and play games in the Soviet Union. I talked about in '69 that a Canadian team had played in the Izvestia tournament in Moscow, and there have been other teams that had come to play from different countries, but this is the first time a huge number of fans came. 3,000 Canadians came to watch these games in Moscow. Think about that. 3,000 Canadians, some of which are just, semi-hockey celebrities, right? Cyclone Taylor's there, Harold Ballard's there, a whole bunch of these guys are there. But you've got at least 1,500 of these, like literally, Serge and Sally off the street of Montreal and Toronto. They paid the whatever, $800 or something, and took the week off work, and off they went to Moscow. So you've got like just a whole bunch of people off the streets of, Kenora and Moose Jaw, all of a sudden showing up in 1972 Moscow in the Soviet Union. You can already begin to guess the initial shock, not just for the Canadians that are there, but for the Soviets themselves. And again, you can go into tremendous detail of reading the interactions, some of which were really heartwarming and others which were not, the kind of surveillance that even the Canadian fans were under, how watched they were, but the Canadian team was different, was the kind of things that were, in a sense, the psychological warfare that was played on them was pretty intense, with the idea of, getting the team off its game. But once again, you've got a very cornered group. Doing things like this is going to get them even more and more resilient to defeat your opponent. So from problems at the airport, problems to getting to the game, they brought over enough food with them. They brought over steaks and beers and various food, and all of a sudden half of it was missing. Never explained, it was just missing. So what meant is that technically they only had enough food for the players. They didn't have enough food for the wives. So the wives were given typical Russian food at the time in the 1970s, which, it's, again, not Russia now, right? Russia in the Soviet Union was very, very different. Very, very different experience on all levels. Like if you go to Moscow today, you'll get great meals, guaranteed. You were not going to get great meals in 1972. And the food that a lot of the wives started to get was making them ill. They were literally all getting sick. And so the Canadian players had to, in many cases, stop eating a lot of the food, their own food, in the course of the games so that the wives would have something to eat. Because I can't remember who it was, maybe Brad Park or something, that said it would have been worse to have let our wives get angry while we were in Russia. We would rather go with less food and not be totally, having enough calories going into the games than having our wives upset all day because they weren't eating, because of how they were eating. So they literally had to. So that was going on. The night before game days, they would be getting, phone calls would happen 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. They would rip their phone out of the wall, and then 10 minutes later, a repairman would come to put the phone back in. And, so these kind of things were just annoying them to no end. They knew that the rooms were bugged. They knew that they were going to be monitored. And some of the guys, of course, went to extremes. There's a famous story of one day, I can't remember, it was Cashman and Esposito and a few others were looking for the bugs in the room. They were going to find where the KGB bugs were that were listening to them, and they found these things in the floor, which they figured, that's what it is. and they got like a makeshift screwdriver and took all these things out of the floor that they figured were the bugs, and then all of a sudden they heard a smash. And when they went downstairs, they realized that those were the bolts that were holding the chandelier in the main ballroom up. And so they just, smashed the giant chandelier in the room down there. They'd eventually pay for its, replacement. But so those kinds of things are going on, and those kind of things are in the player's mind where you don't know who or what's watching you, who or what's listening to you, who or what is about ready to throw you off, who or what might try to poison some food you're going to eat. This is the mentality that they've got. And even though they took, as they have claimed, some very nice tours, they were set on tours I think they went to the Bolshoi Ballet, they did a tour of the Kremlin, they did these sort of normal tourist things on the off days. They were very wary of what they were doing. So that's important to see on from that side. Simplified, the games in Moscow start. Well, actually, I'll leave it there. There's 40 minutes. I'll take it to that point in time. No, we'll do game 5. We might still do game 5 and get the first game out of the way. Finish with the next part and finish off the series. So game 5, Canada comes out. I think they're leading 4-1 midway through the second period, and they look really, really good. Like, it's a completely different hockey team that's playing game 5 in Moscow. The most obvious difference is that the players are skating at a much higher level. More and more practice time, more and more on ice time has been really, really good for the team. Of course, the bonding element, the us against the world element has produced an intense drive. They're playing really, really well. They're also handling the big ice surface very, very well. Like I talked about, actually, I think a more skilled team is actually hurt on a bigger ice surface. And technically, the Soviets as a whole were a better skilled team from the standpoint of everybody. Their skating, their puck handling, those kind of things. So they were actually hurt playing on the big ice surface as opposed to the small ice surface in North America. But they're up 4-1, and the team collapses. It's a really amazing thing to watch, actually, how all of a sudden the game goes from 4-1 to 5-4, and how easy the Soviets kind of just seemed to turn it up for 10 or 12 minutes of the game and take complete control. On one sense, to everyone watching that, they were probably pretty clear the series is over. The Soviets were unbelievably clear. Now we've just won this game. We just have to win any of the next 3 games. The confidence level on their side was immense, but interestingly, when the game ended, the confidence level for the Canadians was quite high as well. The 3,000 people cheered them off that were there, cheered them off the ice. And of course, you can go into all the stories of the challenges between the spectators and the police at the games, and they were also not used to having 3,000 screaming fans in the game. Another thing that people who watch the games, the games, the Moscow version of the games, are always surprised about is that they talk about the Soviet fans are so robotic. They don't cheer. They just sit there. And well, what people don't really understand is that those weren't actually the regular Soviet hockey fans. You're not watching what a regular Soviet. That this was like an event like this was pretty much party members only, and it was almost like you had to be personally invited by the Politburo to have a ticket for this game. So these were all people that were somehow connected to the entire party membership and had a particular expectation of how they were supposed to behave in front of the crowd. So in front of the leaders of the Kremlin who were there watching the games. So, but you have this incredible dichotomy of the way that the Soviet spectators who did have tickets and were at the game behaved compared to the sort of screaming Canadians that were there, and the way they behaved in the games. Game 5 is also known for the Phil Esposito fall in the pregame introductions, where he steps on a flower petal from girls that have been bringing flowers on the ice and has a fall, which also kind of calmed the team down. But again, they had this incredible burst of this 4-1 lead to all of a sudden have them lost 5-4. It was while they felt very confident in the dressing room after. Of course, they felt like we're playing better than them now. Like, we're actually playing better than them now. But they also realized, but we're running out of games. Like, now we can't lose anymore. So it was a very tough thing. Like, it of course made it great for the storyline, for the movie script that the series really was. But had they been able to hold on and win that game, the next three would have become very, very different already. But that loss, of course, at the end of the whole, looking back on the whole thing, also seemed to be helpful, because it did once again put the Soviets into the. You kind of switched the whole mindset, right? Before game 1, it was the Canadians who arrogantly believe they've got the series at hand. There's nothing they can't lose. Not going to happen. And the Soviets were there to just, let's see what we can do and play our best and see how it turns out. Now that it's after game 5, that switches. Now a different mentality comes into the Soviet coaching staff and the Soviet players, that kind of, we got this game, we got the series. It's, guaranteed. No way we're going to lose. Canadians have flipped this over to, well, we'll just go out and play and see what we can do. And we'll get into the final 3 games coming up. But after this, after I posted this a couple of days, I'll post, which was part 1, I'll post that up of the roster choices, etc. And then I'll finish with the final games and the most important part of the discussion, which is what this really meant to hockey in North America and Europe. That'll be the most important part of this discussion. Is here's how it's presented. This series affected hockey going forward in the future, but here's how it really did. Here's what really came or did not come out of this series on both sides. All right, there's I guess part 3 technically, even though it's part 2 that you're reading. I'll put up part 1 in a few days and finish up the series later next week. Cheers.